It's about accepting that we live in a society where no one is born as a fully formed activist or a pure person. In fact, they never will be. Nobody comes into the world holding a Virginie Despontes book in one hand and a Bourdieu book in the other.
Buzz.
Quoi buzz?
Buzz.
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 Welcome, bienvenue, marhaba bikoum to Buzz Voices of Defiance, the podcast for minoritized people who are ready to shake up the world. I'm Shama, and every day I work with minoritized entrepreneurs, helping them find their voice, overcome their fears, and attract people who share their values, all to truly make an impact on the world. Buzz is one of my favorite words in Moroccan Darija. It's an expression of surprise. Surprise at the boldness of those who have defied the obstacles of an oppressive society and decided, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. And it's also the surprise of that same oppressive society when it sees all these people pushing back. These are the people I want to give a platform to. And I also want to encourage you to speak out. Because only together can we change the game and finally change the world.
Buzz.
I'm so excited to hand the mic to Jasmine TOUITOU today. Jasmine is an expert in storytelling and personal branding, but more than that, she was the very first person I saw on social media and thought, wow, how does she manage to be so unapologetically herself? How does she not fear judgment? Jasmine is someone you either love or you don't, but one thing's for sure, you cannot ignore her. And I think today's conversation will leave you feeling the same way. After all, we're not here to create a polished, perfectly smooth podcast. With Jasmine, we talked about how injustice drives political commitment, her experience in activist spaces, the impact of activism on mental health and how to protect it, the importance of care, the contradictions of being a politically active individual, and also hope, forgiveness, and humanity. This episode was originally recorded in French, and I'm still trying to figure out the best way for you guys to access French interviews. Today, I'm using AI for Jasmine's part, and I recommend listening at a 1.2 speed. All right, enjoy! Hi, Jasmine. I'm so excited to have you on Buzz Voices of Defiance. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Well, I'm doing great, and I'm genuinely so happy to have you here. Without further ado, let me kick things off with the question I love to start every episode with. What was the first act of rebellion you can remember? And do you know what feeling, emotion, or spark led you to it?
When you told me about this first question, this icebreaker, it really got me thinking. I feel like there have been so many acts of rebellion, so many moments where I pushed back, but I think one of the earliest that really stands out was when I was a kid. To keep it short, I had a cousin who's about the same age as me and whom I see as a sister, because we grew up together. The thing is, she's my cousin through her father. Her father is my mom's brother. At one point, her father remarried, and she got the classic evil stepmother. Like the real deal, horrible and genuinely cruel, doing awful things to her. I must have been really little, maybe around 10 at most. One of the first times I ever stood up and said, stop, was because of her. My cousin was so scared of her stepmother that she wouldn't even dare call her own dad because the stepmother wouldn't let her talk to him. One day she asked me to make the call for her. So I did. I called, and of course her stepmother picked up. I remember saying hello in my tiny voice, and she replied. I said, "Can I speak to Beep?" Referring to my uncle. She asked, "What do you want to tell him?" Because she knew I was always with my cousin. And I said, "That's none of your business. I just want to talk to him." Then she said, "Well, he's my husband." And I shot back, "Well, he's my uncle, so give him the phone." I was so young, but something inside me just snapped. I couldn't stand the injustice, it eats me up inside. I found her behavior so mean and unfair. So I lost it. I called her a bitch on the phone and I told her I was going to pull her hair out. I'll never forget it. Then I hung up. The funny part of the story is that later that night, this aunt called my mom to complain. My mom ended up sort of defending me. She said, "Well, yes, Jasmine shouldn't have spoken like that, but it's strange." Why were you so interested in knowing what she wanted to say to her uncle? And while we're on the topic, you're not exactly kind to my niece." So, I didn't even get in trouble. If anything, it reinforced my sense of justice even more. Should I have called her a bitch? Probably not. But honestly, in that moment, I meant it, and she deserved it.
You know, that doesn't surprise me at all. This story is so you. We don't know each other super deeply on a personal level, but I've been following you on social media for quite a while. We talk often in the DMs, and we've even worked together. And honestly, it just feels so in line with who you are and how you present yourself online. But when we talk about rebellion, it's usually about rebelling against something. You're not born that way from the start, right? So do you feel like before that moment or other moments like it around the same time, you were someone who conformed? And if so, in what way? And on top of that, are there other times in your life, whether personal or professional, where you feel like you've conformed?
It's so interesting because you mentioned, before that moment, were there times when you conformed? And it's intriguing because it makes it seem like rebellion and conformity are opposites. And they are. But that hasn't stopped me from moving between the two in a single day. Before that moment in my life, since I was so young, I'd say no, because at that stage I wasn't conforming. But it wasn't really about rebelling either. It was just that my brain didn't work the same way as others. I have ADHD and some traits of high intellectual and emotional sensitivity, so I just didn't understand concepts like proper decorum or how things should be done. So yes, there were times when I conformed and others when I rebelled, but they were never far apart. Even today, there are moments when I conform. As a kid, though, I wasn't aware of it. I just didn't conform. I stood out, and not out of rebellion, but simply because I was me. For example, in my family, little girls were expected to always sit with their legs closed, but I'd always sit with my legs wide open, and I couldn't understand why my aunts were always saying, "Close your legs." To me, those rules just seemed strange, and I didn't know how to do anything other than be myself. So as a kid, I wasn't rebelling. I was just being 100% natural. And I think life later taught me when to shut up, when to conform, and when to hold back. So yes, there are moments I've conformed. Of course. Honestly, let's not kid ourselves. Getting through 5 years of university and earning 2 master's degrees? That means I conformed at some point. Higher education is so structured that if you manage to finish, it's because you played by the rules. You wrote the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis essays, even if you didn't believe in the antithesis. So, yeah, there were plenty of times I conformed, but never to the point of selling out. I've always conformed just enough to get through what I needed to. Sometimes, though, I realized that was a terrible idea. Like when I first started my entrepreneurial journey, I was all beige and neutral tones. I was trying to be this ultra-soft entrepreneur. But over time, I realized that approach made me sick. It wasn't respecting my own needs. Eventually, like in my personal relationships, it started spilling over in ways that weren't healthy. I just can't pretend to be someone I'm not. Recently, I was at a conference in Casablanca, surrounded by people of a certain standing. You can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes. Older folks in finance, pharma, etc. I had to carry myself in a particular way, and that's fine, I can do it. But when I got home, I slept from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. because it completely drained me. For example, during a formal lunch, some Moroccan attendees asked about French politics, and there was this guy at the table who said, "The problem with France today is that it's full of extremes." I almost choked on my food. It cost me so much energy not to lose it. Instead, I calmly replied, "Actually, the French Council of State ruled that LFI is not an extremist party, though the National Rally is." Then he argued that, by strict definition, the National Rally isn't extremist either. It was clear he wasn't far-right himself. He was just some 60-year-old guy nostalgic for the good old days, saying things like, "Can you believe the Gen Z kids these days? At 5 p.m. they close their laptops." I kept it together, but internally I was screaming, "What do you mean? What time do you want them to close it?" So I just replied calmly, Well, for me, work is a means, not an end. Moments like these cost me. They're exhausting because I have to conform to the environment while still quietly pushing back without snapping. But in a way, it's also a valuable challenge. It teaches me to tolerate differing opinions, which I struggled with for a long time. For instance, I recently endured a session of electrolysis for my PCOS. It's horrible, by the way. And the esthetician had RTL playing. It's not music, it's debates. Within 30 minutes, I had to listen to them bash the Yellow Vests movement, and then rant about gender education in schools, with grandmas calling in to say, "I don't want my grandchildren exposed to this gender nonsense." I wanted to scream, "Shut up!" But I endured it. So yes, I sometimes conform because I can't say everything I think. But never for too long, and never to the point of betraying myself.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's true, being nonconformist doesn't mean that every second in every interaction with every person, you're always calling them out and saying, no, you're wrong. That's just not sustainable. At some point, your mental and physical health would completely break down. You wouldn't be able to keep going. So, yeah, you've got to pick your battles.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Some people just can't keep up with always being in fight mode. It's exhausting. And honestly, sometimes it doesn't hurt to actually listen to people, even when you don't agree with them. Listening can teach you a lot about how someone thinks. For me, I don't have an issue debating, or maybe debating is too strong a word, but I don't mind hearing someone's point of view and telling them whether or not I agree. And honestly, sometimes that diffuses the situation. I'll even tell them, "Hey, just because we're talking doesn't mean you have to convince me or that I have to convince you. That's not what this is about. It's just an exchange of thoughts, simple as that." That said, there are limits. If the conversation veers into racism or discrimination of any kind, I'm out. There's no debating that because your point of view puts me and the people I care about in danger. And when that happens, there's nothing more to say. I'm not going to conform, but I'll just leave the room. I don't care about leaving the room if that's what it takes. When I was teaching in middle school, I'd sometimes hear really horrible stuff, like kids saying, "We'll send you back to Congo," or things aimed at girls from the traveling community, mocking their accents. Once, a school supervisor even imitated a student's accent in front of me and looked at me with this smug look, as if expecting me to laugh along. In those moments, I didn't blow up because it wasn't the time or place to go full-on rebellion mode. But I also wasn't going to conform by laughing at something so blatantly wrong. Sometimes conforming is as simple as laughing at a joke that's absolutely not funny. And if it's not funny, I'm not laughing. So yeah, when she gave me that smug, "We're on the same page" look, I just stared back and walked away. I wasn't angry in the way I might have been in a more rebellious moment, but I wasn't going to play along to make everyone comfortable either.
That's super interesting. And like you said, when it comes to certain forms of oppression or discrimination, that's where you draw the line. Earlier, you mentioned that injustice is at the heart of all your acts of rebellion, that it's something that profoundly impacts you. So it doesn't surprise me at all that at some point in your life, given everything you've shared, you ended up joining activist circles. Can you tell us how old you were when you got involved in those spaces and what that experience was like for you?
You should know that I was never raised in a militant family. We're very depoliticized. Politicization, after all, requires a certain level of knowledge and exposure, and that just wasn't part of my upbringing. In my family, it's as simple as this. They vote for Macron, not because they're Macron supporters, but because, in their eyes, he's not an extreme. They don't feel threatened, and they haven't really grasped the nuances. So I didn't grow up with that kind of education. For me, I came to feminism through anti-racism, and honestly, it all started online. It was around the time I was finishing school and entering university. And entering university, especially depending on what field you're in. Well, let me clarify. If you go to a business school, I'm not sure it's the same thing, but I was studying literature, and that required a lot of work around ideas, philosophy, sociology. It was during that time that I met people who were more knowledgeable than I was. But those interactions didn't happen in real life. They happened online. Back then, it was mostly through platforms like Twitter and Facebook, though I can't remember which one exactly. I vividly recall a girl I knew, someone deeply engaged in anti-racism, who introduced me to the subject. That sparked something in me, and I dove into anti-racism, which then led me to feminism through that lens. Her ideas resonated with me, and from there, I started reading a lot of books. On Twitter, I connected with people who were just as angry as I was. It wasn't a beautiful time. It was a heavy, intense period. Eventually, we formed a collective, though I won't name it because I'm trying to forget it. There were about 10 of us, and we became somewhat known in the activist circles in Lyon. It lasted maybe 2 years, but we all ended up leaving. It was the worst idea. Why? Because we were all angry and not in a good place mentally. I don't have a strong opinion on anarchism. On one hand, I like the idea of a non-hierarchical structure, but anarchism can be organized. In our case, there was no decision maker, and that created a situation where egos clashed. Everyone wanted to take the lead, and for those of us with strong personalities, it was tough. I know I can sometimes come off as taking up too much space, and it made things even more complicated. Over those 2 years, we did some meaningful work. For example, we mobilized after the death of Adama Traoré, which was still early in that movement. We also raised awareness about blackface. But as always, there was too much anger for us to create something truly sustainable. Even though we had important things to say, I couldn't see where we were heading. By the end, everyone burned out. Everyone just walked away. And honestly, good riddance. At least for me, it was for the best. As for the others, I'm not sure. I haven't kept in touch with everyone. But yeah, separating was the right decision. Nothing truly beautiful came out of it in the end.
Okay, I see. So you're saying that everyone experienced activist burnout. And I also remember when we talked about this before, you brought up the concept of militant purity. For people who might not know what activist burnout or militant purity is, could you go over them and explain, especially in the case of militant purity, why it was problematic in those spaces?
Militant purity, as I perceive it, may not have been fully theorized, but I experience it as something somewhat dehumanizing. It often arises from theoretical ideals found in books about what we should be. However, these ideals often overlook the reality of the systems we exist within. Militant purity focuses on what we should be in an ideal world, but doesn't account for human imperfections. As a result, it lacks a certain humanity. Doubt, questions, and behaviors that don't align with perfection as defined by certain theories leave no room for conversation or restorative justice. Instead, it leans heavily on punitive justice. Ironically, the activists I worked with were supposedly anti-carceral, advocating for the abolition or at least reform of prisons. Yet, I witnessed behaviors entirely at odds with that ideal. For instance, after I had already left those spaces, I saw lists circulating. These lists named individuals labeled as problematic or having behaved poorly, effectively creating a blacklist of people to avoid. The accusations ranged from severe claims of sexual assault to things like fetishistic behavior or admitting, "Yeah, I'm racist." I mean, what? Everyone has internalized racism to some degree, let's be real. But militant purity dictates that if you don't meet certain criteria, you're a bad person. Period. As for activist burnout, it's similar to any other kind of burnout. It's what happens when you pour yourself fully into something until it drains you completely. You can experience burnout in family roles, for instance, with something like maternal burnout or postpartum depression. Or in work-related contexts, where the demands of the job leave you completely depleted. Activist burnout specifically arises when you're consumed by activism to the point that it drains all your energy and leads to depression. Activist burnout can be especially intense because the spaces in which you operate are often steeped in heaviness. There's a fantastic Substack newsletter by Louise Morel, an author and activist, called Le Grain. In her newsletter, she dives deep into the topic of joy in activism. It's so important because activist burnout is compounded by the constant exposure to terrible realities. I've noticed that many of my activist friends are not in a great place mentally. One of my best friends who is deeply involved in activism was at my place recently. She's heavily engaged in structured initiatives, declared associations, and large organizations. She's constantly working for causes like Palestine and always on the go. She told me, "I'm exhausted." But when I asked why she doesn't slow down, she explained that psychologically, existing in this society without doing something feels unbearable for her. For me, it's different. I can bear it. Maybe because I've been so disgusted by these spaces and frightened by how they made me feel. At my worst, I was suicidal, and that experience was so terrifying that I now have strict boundaries. If there's even a chance that I might spiral back into that mindset, I protect myself and say no. I think she still has a bit more faith than I do. To remain active in these spaces, you need to believe in the possibility of change to some extent. That's the cruel success of the system, convincing people like me to lose hope. In a way, it's as if I've surrendered. That's the heartbreaking reality.
That's really interesting because indeed, if you don't have hope, there's no point in pushing forward. It makes no sense. And when you say that out loud, when you realize, oh, I'm more disillusioned than she is, and I've kind of given up, how does that feel for you to say it out loud like that, you know? Because I know, and you've told me this before, that mental health is a hugely important topic for you. The lack of care within activist spaces has such a massive impact on that. And from what I understand, from what you're saying, it's that impact on your mental health that ultimately led you to step away from those spaces. So, how do you feel now looking back on it about what happened, your activism, and your desire for a different world? How do you process all of that now?
I think I'm handling it pretty well. Yes, people around me are often more actively engaged. They'll attend protests, take action, etc. And I admit, it's been a while since I've done that. But I don't feel like I've sold my soul or abandoned my principles. My way of staying engaged, even though I don't consider myself an activist anymore, is by trying to be a good person in my relationships. I've learned things, and I try to apply them, whether in friendships, romantic relationships, or elsewhere. That for me is a way of honoring where I come from. Then there's also how I talk about what I believe with the people around me, like my family. In my family, I'm considered the feminist, the anti-racist, the loud one who takes up space. That's also a way of staying engaged. I've stopped aspiring to change the world in a big way. Instead, I focus on what I can do on my small scale. That doesn't mean I'm passive. For instance, if we're discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict, I won't hesitate to share my principles. But I've also learned to keep quiet when I don't fully understand something. To be clear, that doesn't mean I'm silent about Israel-Palestine because I don't know enough. I know my principles on that subject. But if I want to have an eloquent, impactful discussion, I'll go to a bookstore, buy 2 or 3 books, and come back more informed. In the past, I used to lash out in anger, refusing to engage with ideas I didn't agree with. Now I take a more measured approach. Saying, what's happening in Palestine is wrong, is true, but it's not persuasive. Activism, whether we like it or not, is about convincing others. That's why when I talk to people, I sometimes don't try to convince them, because I'm not an activist anymore. But when you're in an activist mindset, the goal is to educate and persuade people to agree with you. It's not enough to say, it's a genocide and it's bad. You need to prove it, explain how it's happening, why it's happening, and the larger goals behind it. Why are women and children being targeted? Why is there an annexation of Palestine by Israel? You need to back it up with facts. I used to be much more present in activism, but I'll admit, a part of it was ego-driven. It was about existing, about being visible. That's something Siham Asbaghe, a militant I admire, talks about, ego in activism. She says it's an issue because, for some of us, it's about being seen. I'm not actively fighting for systemic change anymore because I've stopped believing in a larger-scale transformation. but I still stand firm in my values. For a long time, I stopped reading feminist books entirely because I was so disillusioned. Honestly, there was a point where, if I could have been right-wing, I might have been, because it seems less painful to be right-wing. It's hard being on the far left. It's not comforting. Recently, though, I read Dorothy Allison's 2 or 3 Things I Know for Sure, and it was the first feminist essay I'd read in years. There was a time when I completely stopped engaging with that kind of content. Why am I telling you all this? I don't know. I tend to ramble. But basically, you asked how I feel about stepping away from activism. And honestly, I feel okay about it because I still share my ideas in my own small way without performing. I live with a lot of contradictions, and I think that's fine. I try to embody the values I believe in, apply the theories I've read to my own life, and share them with the people I care about. And if I can talk about them on my platforms, great. For example, when the National Assembly was dissolved, I went straight to TikTok to post about it. It was visceral, I had to do it. I'm not saying my videos swayed anyone's vote, but I felt compelled to share. So, it depends on the urgency of the issue and my mood. These days, I prioritize myself and listen to my own needs before jumping into action.
I totally get what you mean. I created this podcast for a very specific reason. I talk to and see so many people, and mainly entrepreneurs, who are politically aware in their personal lives, who discuss all these topics with the people they feel safe with, but who don't feel at all comfortable saying it loud and clear on their professional platforms. Often it's because they don't feel legitimate, because they don't feel expert enough, quote unquote. I hate that word. Or because they constantly compare themselves to others, especially within activist spaces. Activism feels out of reach to them. But the truth is, dedicating your life to activism is a privilege. Not everyone has the time or the financial means to make it their full time focus. That's why this podcast exists, to build a bridge. It's a connection between those we traditionally define as activists, the ones out in the streets at every protest, and all these other people we need who are far more numerous. These are people who are already engaging with these issues 24/7, in their personal lives, but they don't dare to take it further. We need to rally all those people together. And today, you're such a clear example on that. You may not be in activist spaces the way you used to be, but you remain deeply committed, as shown by the examples you've given. Even just presenting yourself like openly as a North African Muslim lesbian woman on social media, being fully yourself, is a political act in and of itself. Let's be clear about that. So, in your view, if you were speaking to people who are just starting out, who might come to you and say, Jasmine, I want my business to be about more than just myself. I want my communication through my business to be a tool of resistance. What would you say to them? What concrete advice would you give?
Actually, I want to try to nuance and challenge the thought a little. For example, I've been around people who are activists, and I don't think it's a privilege. It's a very courageous choice, but one that I didn't make and that many people can't afford to make. These are people who are sometimes on welfare, people who would rather beg than integrate into the capitalist system. These are people who prefer to live in squats rather than accept the system as it is. Some don't even have legal papers. There are privileged activists. Privileged activists are people like me and many others who had access to literature, and after that chose to pursue activism, who had access to education, and then later chose to do something else. And then there are activists who are not privileged at all. Even when most people don't have a choice, some still make very different choices from mine. Honestly, I wouldn't say these people are more activists than me, but maybe they are, and that's okay. Maybe they have values so intrinsic to them that living within the system, accepting the system, is unbearable for them. So I want to give credit where it's due. There are people who genuinely put their lives and their fight at the center of their existence without expecting anything in return other than a better world. They're rare, very rare. Then there are people who don't care at all, And then there are people like me who have their values and their fight, but who still play the capitalist game, make money, enjoy things, etc., without forgetting where they came from. Now, I'll try to address those people who are like me. The point is, we're not perfect at all. In fact, I know anarchist, anti-capitalist friends who, if I told them I wanted to make my business an act of resistance, they'd say, "Stop talking nonsense. That's not resistance." But here's the thing I've learned in life. As a Muslim and lesbian woman, one of my biggest lessons: life is full of contradictions. And if you have to choose wisely. There's this video I keep seeing on the internet, especially in the sports context. I do a lot of sports, where someone says, "Oh, I missed Monday's workout, so I won't go Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday." That way of thinking is like saying, "I spilled sauce on my jacket, so I'll just roll around in more sauce." Living with contradictions means accepting that even if there's a stain on your jacket, you can still wear it and clean it. What I mean is, having a business is not inherently anti-capitalist, nor is it inherently capitalist. It exists within a capitalist system. For it to truly be capitalist, you'd need to have employees working for you, and, as Marx theorized, you'd own the means of production, while they'd have nothing. But for solopreneurs, except maybe agency owners, that's not the case. So, let's clarify capitalism here. Redefining capitalism aside, it's still challenging to claim a business as an act of resistance. I think it's more about asking yourself, how can I align my business with my resistance and my values? Having a business doesn't inherently make you a resistor. That's not true. In my case, I became an entrepreneur because I wanted to make money and be independent, and because with my personality, a traditional job was impossible. Then I decided that, as long as I was going to be an entrepreneur, I might as well wake up every morning motivated and go to bed proud of myself. That's the approach to take. If your sole goal is to change the world and resist, then yes, go full-on activist. But if you want to use your business as a tool for your values, then we can talk about it. Start by working on your manifesto, how you present yourself to the world. Choose your audience based on your values and what you stand for. It's perfectly fine to cater only to women or even only to racialized women. For example, Marie Da Silva, a Black career coach, built her entire career on helping racialized women navigate hostile work environments. Create content aligned with your values, but keep in mind this perspective is coming from someone privileged. If you're just starting out, it's normal to feel hesitant about expressing your values openly or taking a strong stance. Strategic resistance is also valid, and Shama could help you find ways to resist without endangering your business. That said, some issues are just about justice and morality. For example, saying it's unfair that we voted for a leftist party and ended up with a right-wing prime minister isn't controversial. Sometimes just stating the obvious injustices can be a form of resistance. I also want to address this professional-personal life divide. The idea that we're two separate people, one at work and one at home, is a capitalist construct. Humans weren't designed to split themselves in two. When we suppress our emotions to fit into a professional mold, it's unsustainable. Your values are part of you. They run through your blood, your veins, your mind. So why pretend to be someone you're not? At some point, you'll break because that misalignment will make you deeply unhappy. There are ways to express your values subtly and elegantly, but you'll still be expressing them. Ultimately, aligning your business with your values isn't just about the business. It's about living authentically.
Absolutely, totally. That dissociation you're talking about is exactly what I experienced last year. It was around the events of October 7th, and I completely disappeared from my professional socials. On my personal socials, I kept talking about it and talking and talking, and at some point I thought, well, I need to work. If I don't work, like nothing's gonna happen money wise. Then I found myself going back to my professional socials thinking, okay, am I just going to talk about business as if nothing happened? It was impossible. It was absolutely impossible. And for me, this dissociation lasted for years, starting at the end of my studies, which triggered for me a news related burnout because I was studying political science and focusing on conflicts for 6 years, especially in the region I come from. So it was incredibly tough. And to protect myself, I dissociated for years and years. I kept the personal shama separate from the professional shama. And we didn't talk about the same topics. Uh, but at but at some point, it's just not sustainable. We talk a lot about burnout due to workload, but in reality, what makes you crack is that clash of values, as you mentioned, that becomes unmanageable. So I told myself, okay, I'm not waiting for this to happen again. I've already been through this and I'm not going to do it again. That's when everything changed. It was time to repoliticize what I was doing. And of course, everyone has to find their own way of doing that. And you're absolutely right, by the way, to clarify the terms you mentioned earlier, not just about privilege when it comes to activism, but also the context. I specifically think of conversations I've had with activists. I remember one single mother telling me, I can't do this anymore. I need to step back because it's unmanageable, balancing my activism with feeding my kids. And another conversation with someone else who said something along the lines of what you mentioned, like, that people who are financially insecure and not privileged are a minority. The rest are people who can comfortably afford to do activism. From what I've understood about these spaces, because I wasn't deeply involved myself, there sometimes seems to be resentment. Like people saying, oh, you can afford to do this, but I can't. Or you think you're purer than me. Even though no one actually thought those things, they were feelings that came up. Anyway, that's a whole other topic we could discuss for another hour. What was really interesting about your clarification earlier was the distinction between business as a tool of resistance. Of course, the business itself is not inherently a tool of resistance. It's about having a business, like you've decided it before, and deciding that it won't just serve you. At some point, make it about something bigger, something collective. And I just released a podcast episode this week on capitalism, entrepreneurship, and related topics because I hear so many people saying different things. On one side, people say, oh, if I'm committed and anti capitalist, how can I make money? And on the other side, you have people who are all about money, 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 saying, oh, you politically active entrepreneurs just want to stay poor. Like, no way. We're in a capitalist system and we need money. When did you think we wanted to stay poor? That just doesn't make sense. So, I wanted to clarify those terms. And I also wanted to circle back to something about activist spaces and mental health because I know it's important for you. In your opinion, what needs to change in these spaces to avoid these impacts on mental health? You talked about people feeling unwell and entering spaces where everyone else is also unwell, which creates a collective spiral into negativity. What, in your view, could be done to better protect vulnerable people who join these spaces? Because it's crucial. And what could be done to keep the struggles healthy and sustainable? I don't know if we can talk about efficiency when it comes to political struggles, but at least keeping them healthy in the long term.
I think we can talk about efficiency in activism, in the sense that if we have a goal, the question is whether we're achieving it. Actually, if activism used KPIs a bit more, maybe things would improve, and we could avoid doing things just for the sake of intellectual posturing. For example, KPIs could look like this. We launch a campaign, conduct a survey at the start to gauge public opinion, and then another one afterward to see if we've managed to shift mentalities at our level. But to return to the topic of mental health, I think it's a tough question because I've been so disillusioned that, at one point, I was disillusioned with humanity itself. I thought when you put humans together, they mess it up unless there's structure. There's a philosophical tale about this, whether we need structure to behave properly. But I've forgotten the title. If it comes back to me, I'll include it in the summary. I was so disillusioned with people that I didn't know what to think. But at my level, what I do know is that people should participate in groups that are bigger than themselves. That means avoiding groups where you're seen as a star, which is a big issue in activist spaces. This sterification of activists. There's a huge amount of sterification in these circles. Instead, you need to accept doing things that contribute to something greater, to be part of larger organizations and just be part of the workforce, so to speak. You're not changing the world by yourself. You're just helping everyone change the world together. But you, personally, you're nobody. It doesn't matter who you are. You're just part of the bigger picture. That helps you decenter yourself because often, what makes people unwell is being too central to the process. That creates immense pressure. This is about accepting your role within something larger, where it doesn't matter whether you're recognized or not. It's irrelevant. That's a tough pill for people to swallow. It probably would have been difficult for me back then, too. I was younger, and younger people tend to have more ego. I was 20 then. I'm 29 now. I also think it's important to create spaces for dialogue, which I know you're already doing. Another critical point is removing shame. Shame makes people incredibly unwell. For example, admitting, yeah, I've had racist thoughts before, or, yeah, I've acted badly before. It's about accepting that we live in a society where no one is born as a fully formed activist or a pure person. In fact, they never will be. Nobody comes into the world holding a Virginie Despontes book in one hand and a Bourdieu book in the other. We've all been classist, racist, homophobic, or crossed the line at some point. If we remove shame and understand that the problem isn't me, but the system I've internalized, it allows for care to emerge. Because there's a lot of guilt that arises when you become aware of things. If you only realize these things at 30, it's tough. For me, it happened younger, at 20, but even then, I'd look back at 15-year-old me and think about the racist things I'd said or done. When you gain awareness, you need support through that process. That's something activist spaces don't always consider. They bombard you with violence and realizations, leaving you thinking, so I was one of the bad guys too. And that's really damaging. But if you're having those thoughts, it's already a sign you're a relatively good person because bad people don't question whether they're bad. That's another topic, though. This guilt can spiral into obsessions. Mona Chollet recently wrote a book about guilt, and Lauren Bastide launched a podcast about mental health because she was really struggling at one point. Many prominent feminists have been through hard times, and part of the issue is that you often get bashed by people on your own side. It's easier to criticize someone aware and aligned with your values than to call out someone on the opposite side. For example, if you call a right-winger a fascist, they'll just say, okay, and? But if you say something critical to someone on the left, it deeply affects them because they care. So I think it's also about reducing guilt. Accept that we're all born into a system and that the goal isn't to be perfect because perfection doesn't exist. The goal is to strive to be a better person each day, to avoid harming others, to try to be fair. And if you do hurt someone, if you mess up, apologize and work to become better, for yourself and for others. That's already a huge step.
Yeah. So ultimately, really centering care, as you said, focusing on support to help people move past those feelings. All right. What you said about shame being at the core of it all is so true. And I've seen the difference when organizing speaking circles. These circles are there to unshame, to help people release that shame because they hear others who've experienced the same thing and are expressing it in a safe space. And it's so interesting to learn that in those activist spaces, it's not really happening. That instead, it's more about centering egos and focusing on the negative outlook we have on the world, all without hope, which is surprising because activism is supposed to be rooted in hope and faith. So there are contradictions there that are really fascinating. All right, honestly, I'd love to keep talking about this for another 6 hours. It's so interesting, but we're slowly approaching the end of the episode, and I always like to finish with questions that are a little lighter, but actually they're not that light, and more open to close the episode on a personal note. And the first question I'd like to ask you, Jasmine, is this. Um, what's your dream for the world we live in? Since we're focusing on hope today, what's your dream?
Less ego, and more, though this word is often overused, more kindness, but in the sense of care for others. More love, more forgiveness. There are people who are unforgivable. I have people in my life who are unforgivable, not necessarily because what they did is unforgivable, though in some cases it truly is, but because I'm trying to work on the idea that just because someone did something, it doesn't mean that's who they are. That's a concept I'm trying to deconstruct, and it's very difficult, especially in activist spaces. But it's true. Just because you did something, it doesn't mean you are that thing. It's not even the act itself that's unforgivable. It's the people who are unforgivable because they're habitual. They know what they're doing. They don't regret it, and they keep doing it. They do it to others, and then you're left to deal with it. For me, I've lost hope for those people. I don't know what to do. It's pointless, so I've set them aside. But for people who want to become better individuals, who want a fairer society, that's where my focus lies. Because those people are a minority. It's like when women say, "My ex is a narcissist." At some point, I'm sorry, ladies, I love you all. But narcissists make up less than 3% of the population. So unless you all dated the same guy, your ex probably wasn't a narcissist. He was just a jerk. And that's fine. It happens. What I mean is, those truly awful people, the ones who repeatedly do the same harm, once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, without ever reflecting on their actions or sincerely apologizing, I put them aside. They're not worth the conversation. What I care about are the people who want to heal, who want to feel better. I simply aspire to more kindness, more listening, more forgiveness, more honesty, and more solutions. Instead of just pointing fingers, the question should be, what can we do together to make things better, to ensure things go more smoothly? That's truly my dream for a fairer world.
That's amazing. And what are the resources that help you take care of yourself, and move a little closer to that dream every day?
I'm lucky to be surrounded by really good friends. Very, very good friends. I'm also fortunate because, in my work, I'm surrounded by people who think like me. These are incredibly thoughtful and deep individuals. What helps me is Tartine, my dog. Because of Tartine, or thanks to Tartine, I go to the dog park, and as a result, I meet a lot of people who are nothing like me and don't think like me, but it's good for me. It gets me out of my bubble. It's also my best friends. I don't have many, maybe 5 or 6 really close friends, but they make such a huge difference. They know everything about me. It's so important to have people you can share everything with, without shame, people who listen to your experiences without anger, and who teach you to care as well. I recently rewatched Desperate Housewives, and there's a scene where Andrew tells his mom, "I hate you," and she responds, "The opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. If you still hate me, it means I still matter to you." That really hit me. These are also people who help me move beyond anger towards those who've hurt me. I don't even want to feel the opposite of love anymore. I want to feel nothing. What's done is done. It doesn't need to happen again. At least, I hope not. So my friends, Desperate Housewives and my shows, cooking, going to CrossFit, and going to therapy. I've been seeing a therapist for a long time, and honestly, I highly recommend it if you can afford it. In France, we could talk about this for hours, but psychologists aren't covered by Social Security, while psychiatrists are. But they're medical doctors, not necessarily therapists, so that's another conversation. Still, therapy is such a relief. Therapy helps with anger, whether it's anger at others or ourselves. Good therapy, at least. Anger can be a useful driver, but it's exhausting. Care, on the other hand, is replenishing. So, yeah, a lot of things. Basically, my whole life. I've worked hard to build a life that feels good to me. There's very little I endure these days.
That's great. That's really good. And you're absolutely right to bring up anger because for me, anger is something that's very much a part of who I am, but there was a time when it overshadowed so many other things. The goal isn't to erase it because it's a real emotion, it exists, and it can indeed be very powerful. It drives me every day, but it drives me because I've integrated care alongside it. Without care, you can't manage it in a sustainable way.
Exactly. I actually see anger more as a little engine in the background, you know? It's not the primary driver. Anger shouldn't be the thing that makes you speak, because when you speak out of anger, even if you have incredibly important things to say, you put yourself at a disadvantage. And since the goal ultimately is to change the world, so to speak, you can't afford to put yourself at a disadvantage. You have to be careful. And I know it's not fair, because then you get labeled as the angry black woman or the angry Arab woman, but it's the truth. When you shout, when you make people uncomfortable, they stop listening. And then all it takes is for a white woman to start crying, and the entire conversation ends right there. People stop listening to you. But the goal is for people to hear you. So sometimes, you do have to play the game. You have to acknowledge, okay, the anger is there, but it's not the anger that's going to speak. The anger is my engine. What's going to speak is me, my love for myself and my love for the world. And that's something entirely different.
That's super interesting. And since we're talking about perception, like, how people perceive us and how we perceive others, it connects perfectly to the title of the podcast, buzz. So, just to remind everyone listening, buzz is a word slash onomatopoeia in Moroccan Darija, the Moroccan dialect. It can express surprise in two ways: a positive one, like, oh, wow, that's incredible what you've done, a sort of, admiration for someone's boldness or audacity, or it can be sarcastic, like, oh, wow, look at that. For example, like, I don't know, if someone builds their platform on fighting corruption and then it's revealed that they've been taking bribes all along, you'd sarcastically say, ewa buzz. It's very much, well, isn't that something kind of vibe? So for you, who or what would you like to send a positive buzz to? And who or what would you sarcastically send a, negative blase buzz to?
Oh boy, I have to say, Shama warned me that she was going to ask this question, and I thought I'd have the answer by the time we got here. But nope, I still don't. So, my buzz positive. I'd like to send it to people who are doing their best every day. Honestly, that's really what I've been trying to get across in this conversation. That I don't aspire to perfection, but I do admire people who are trying to be better versions of themselves. And to me, that takes an insane amount of courage and a deep sense of right and wrong, justice and fairness. So, it's for those people. Those who are doing their best in simple, everyday things, raising kids, taking care of their mental health, their work, their commitments, basically people who, at the end of the day, want to have contributed something positive to others. And for the negative buzz, I'm honestly disgusted sometimes. So really, the negative buzz is for this system. And yeah, it's for Macron. Because I saw something earlier today, and I swear, sometimes I just pretend I didn't see things because it's enough to drive you mad. Like, Netanyahu has legal charges against him right now. I don't know if you saw that. And apparently there's some kind of arrest warrant or something. I didn't dig too deep, but I saw it. And then Macron comes out and says, oh, don't worry, he'll be safe here, that we won't extradite him. Like, bravo. Seriously, bravo. Fantastic. This is the same guy who did the same thing with, what's his name again? The guy who assaulted a 13-year-old girl? And then he went on to make more movies. Polanski. Yes, Polanski. You have to understand, there are countries, like most of the world, where he is absolutely not welcome. There are only about 5 countries that will take him. His home country, Poland, Switzerland, because they never take a stance, France. And I can't remember the others. There might be 3 or 5 total that accept him. And now here we are, still following the same playbook, bringing in all the world's garbage and providing them a safe haven. So, bravo. Seriously, we're all just thrilled. We expected nothing, but somehow we still managed to be disappointed. Thank you so much, Macron. Honestly, I wish I hadn't seen what he said today, because it was just disgusting. I just can't with him anymore. It's not like we were expecting miracles, but every time he finds a way to make things worse. And it's not just about him, it's about the entire system he represents. A system that enables people like Netanyahu or Polanski to get away with everything, while regular people are struggling just to get by or live with a shred of dignity.
If we start listing all the buzzes for Macron, I don't think we'll ever be done. All right, so to wrap things up, do you have any updates or news you'd like to share with us?
Right now, I'm working on relaunching the BBO to help you with your storytelling, personal branding, and/or copywriting, without selling your soul. It's about creating a communication strategy that builds loyalty and converts, making people want to work with you specifically because of your personality, your identity, etc. It's coming back in February, so I'm working on that. I even did a new photo shoot, and I look super sexy in it. And voila.
Thank you, Jasmine. So, guys, listen, if you want to work on your storytelling, your personal branding, the BBO is for you. Honestly, we all know the GOAT is Jasmine and no one else, so go check it out. Thank you, Jasmine. Honestly, despite all the technical issues we've had at the beginning, we made it. I'm so happy. Thank you for sticking it out. It was such a great time with you, and I can't wait for us to do it again.
Thank you so much, Shama, for the invitation. I had a blast. Kisses to everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Buzz Voices of Defiance. If you enjoyed it, hit the notification bell to be alerted when new episodes drop and leave a 5-star review to help amplify this podcast that's here to uplift voices the world needs to hear. All right, see you in 2 Tuesdays for another episode to help you turn your business, your project, your art into a tool of resistance, making sure the system looks at you and says, Buzz.
Buzz.